Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. My name is Steve Pally. With me is Professor Galen Jackson of Williams College. We are two international relations PhDs. We went to graduate school at UCLA together, who are trying to explain to ourselves and then hopefully also to you the post-war era, which is where I think we are right now. How you doing, Galen?
I'm all right, man. I'm a little, still upset that there's tons of snow on the ground and it's
You look
March.
cold. You look
It's
very cold.
I got my fire on here, man.
Nice.
I also attended a live performance of A Few Good Men last night.
A live performance?
My friends and I were the youngest people in the audience by 30 to 40 years. So I don't know what it says about my life. That's what I was doing on a Saturday night. But
How was the guy playing Tom Cruise?
that guy was good. So they got the two crucial parts right. The guy that played the Tom Cruise character was good, and the guy that played the Jack Nicholson character nailed it. Like,
fantastic.
yeah.
You can't handle the truth.
You can't handle the, yeah. Crush it, man.
I love that. I love community theater. It's the best. So much passion. All right. So today we are going to be talking about Germany, which is a very important country that people mostly tend to forget about. And there's a reason for that in international relations. And we'll get into that sooner or later. But Germany just had a federal election and they have elected a new government. And that has some pretty interesting implications for European and I would say global security, especially vis-a-vis major developments in U.S. foreign policy that have come up over the last couple of days.
What could you be referring to, Steve?
Oh, I don't know. Apparently something went down in the Oval Office and people got totally freaked out by it.
All right. I'm sure most people have seen it now. Like, leaving aside the substance of the discussion, absolutely wild that all went down on live camera. Like,
never seen anything like it. And
Yeah.
Trump remarked afterwards, we're talking about the open break and shouting match between Zelensky, J.D. Vance, and Trump in the Oval Office during what was supposed to be a signing ceremony for a minerals deal that would bind Ukraine to the United States and provide some kind of implicit security guarantee and a basis for ending the war in Ukraine, supposedly. There's an open shouting match. Trump remarked afterwards, that will make great TV.
Hey, and look, he wasn't wrong.
Yeah, say whatever else you want to say about what went down, and there's like plenty to say about it, and we'll probably get into it, but for sure, compelling television.
Yeah, like the reason that people like when someone handles something in a kind of polite and adept way, it's referred to as being diplomatic, is because that is what diplomats do. They basically paper over differences in public, and you do these things behind the scenes. Publicly, you say we had frank discussions. That's the code word for we disagree.
For shouting matches.
Yes.
Yeah.
You don't have the shouting matches on live TV.
Yeah. Unless you want to have a shouting match and you want to get rid of Zelensky, which we did an episode on Ukraine recently. So go back and watch that. We figured that the Trump administration wanted to drop Ukraine, and this makes it that much easier. And they especially wanted to get rid of Zelensky. So there's no question that this is a big step in that direction.
You know, the other part of that was like, I don't know. I watched a bunch because there's a bunch of different parts depending on which stream you watch. But like when the one guy asked Zelensky why he doesn't wear a suit, and was appalled that he would go into the Oval Office without a suit on, and Zelensky was like, I don't even know what to say to this, bro.
Apparently, they asked him to wear a suit, and he was just like, "Nah, not going to do it."
Okay.
It's off-brand for Zelensky, you know, and Zelensky's a television guy as well, television star formerly in Ukraine, and he's very into branding, and he's known for wearing basically like not combat fatigues, but
it's if Steve Jobs were in the military. It's
it's
like sort of a turtleneck vibe, but like with some fatigue stuff going on a little bit. Yeah.
It's very clean cut, very slimming, and it's like Ukraine branded. He's got like the trident everywhere. It's kind of cool, but they didn't appreciate it. Anyway, so why does this connect to Germany and what has happened in Germany? Can you give us a rundown on that, Galen?
So we'll do a little historical background in just a second, but the recent development was, as Steve said, There was a federal election. The Christian Democratic Union, which is sort of the center right party, this former Chancellor Angela Merkel's party, while she was in office for, I think it was
Quite a
16,
while.
16 years, I think.
Yeah, quite a while.
They won with something like 28, 29% of the vote. The Social Democrats, who had previously been in power under Chancellor Olaf Scholz, really took a drubbing. I think their share of the vote fell to 14, 15%. The headliner was the Alternative for Germany party, the AfD, which I think stands for Alternative for Deutschland. They won about 21% of the vote. So they finished second in the elections.
Yeah. And to put that into perspective, 10 years ago, this party was winning like single digit percentages. In 2021, they won 10%. People were like, uh-oh. They just doubled.
And I would even go a little further. In 2012, this party didn't exist.
Yes, that's right.
It's a very young party. And I think the first time they ran, they didn't clear the thresholds. I'll have to check that. But yeah, like they were kind of hovering around the like 10 to 15 or 10 to 12% mark.
Mhm.
In electoral terms. This really makes them, I don't know, it's hard not to call them mainstream if they're the second biggest party in the country now. And the
Yeah.
reason that's turning heads is this party is a far right party. And I guess I'll rip off Norm Macdonald a little bit here, RIP. You know, I don't know how many of you are history buffs out there, but far right parties in Germany tend to get people concerned for obvious reasons. And this is
Yeah.
a party where the leadership has said things like, I forget which guy in the party it was, but I think in 2018, the leader of the party said something to the effect of the Nazi period was like a single drop of bird shit in an otherwise glorious 1,000-year German history.
At least he
Um,
called it bird shit.
yeah. Yeah, fair enough, I guess. But, you know, really downplaying or trivializing the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And there are members of the party who have taken this further and, you know, somewhat praised former SS members or even praised Germany's performance during the two world wars for basically the entirety of the post-war period, or at least going back to the 1950s when kind of denazification efforts had started to succeed. Germany was held up as an example of a country that had done a remarkably good job of, you know, confronting its past, acknowledging past wrongs. And
Yeah.
there are laws in Germany about denying the Holocaust. This is a major event that puts a lot of that post-war history in question.
It's a major development. So they won 20%. Notably, the far left party, Die Linke, which means the left, also did really well in this election, better than expected, and it nearly reached 10% of the vote. So between the far right and the far left, the parties that are going to be out of power, because the way German democracy works, parliamentary democracy, is unless a party wins a full majority, which no party did, and it's kind of rare that this happens, you're going to be in a coalition. So we're going to get a coalition between the center right party, the Christian Democrats, and the center left party, the Social Democrats in Germany. And this is pretty common in German history. And this coalition tends to do pretty well historically. It's going to be a centrist coalition. However, in order to make really big changes in German policy, constitutional level changes, you need a 2/3 supermajority in the German parliament. And this governing coalition will not have that majority if the far right and the far left parties band together in a blocking coalition. And why is this important and relevant, given all of these moving pieces that we've laid out between the United States, Ukraine, and the change in German politics?
I mean, you might think those are strange bedfellows, and I guess they are, but they do agree on some pretty big matters of policy,
Mhm.
especially getting rid of the provision in German law that puts kind of a cap on how much debt the government can take out.
The debt
So
break.
this sort of If you want to go way back in history, Germans are famously averse to inflation because
They had some
they
issues
had
in the
some
past with
issues.
with hyperinflation.
Yes. During the Weimar period, the republic that immediately preceded the Nazi period, the famous story was always you would go to a bakery to get bread and you'd have to have a
A
wheelbarrow
wheelbarrow.
full of German marks to actually be able to pay for it. And the joke was the baker would say, I don't want your marks, just give me the wheelbarrow. That's more valuable to me. So back when there was the Eurozone crisis in the sort of in the midst of the Great Recession in
Hmm.
08, 09, that's when this debt provision came into play,
Yeah.
because Germans did not want to see inflation, whereas, much of the rest of the continent and the European Union wanted to do more deficit spending and economic stimulus. The Germans were more on the austerity side of things. So to
And
lift
they remain there. Yeah.
Yes. And so to lift that provision, you need a two-thirds majority in the parliament. And the combination of the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats currently do not have it.
Yeah. And this is important and relevant because Germany all of a sudden has a lot of reasons to want to do some deficit spending. By the way, deficit spending is like not intrinsically bad. Lots of countries do it. The United States has gotten really good at deficit spending.
So I would argue that the US is at the point where it could become intrinsically bad if it
Yeah,
doesn't
and
just stop swiping the nation's credit card repeatedly.
that's right. By really good, I mean we've gotten very good at spending money we don't have. Yeah, and like it depends on what you're spending it on. If you're spending it on productive investments in infrastructure and things like that, education, healthcare, then you can make more money later as a result of that stuff, and it's good. If you're spending it on, for instance, rebuilding your army after a very long period of not having one, which would describe the state of Germany, then that
Correct.
can be good too. And so the Merz coalition, the new chancellor is going to be Friedrich Merz, and he has said, as a result of everything that is happening between the Trump administration and Ukraine, Trump no longer cares about Europe. The United States cannot be trusted to provide for European security. Europe must stand up.
And if I were him, I would certainly reach that conclusion.
Yeah, he's not incorrect. Even if the United States were to go back to being, pro NATO, pro Atlanticist with a new administration in 2028, how could the Europeans trust that another administration like the second Trump administration might not come in?
And by the way, like we already saw this dynamic even during Biden's first year in office. The Europeans were basically having to decide, was Trump, a blip on the radar? America got weird for 4 years, and now things will return to normal. And the Biden administration did kind of a lot of reassuring that, yes, like the alliance and transatlantic relations are strong, but I don't think the Europeans can rely on that sort of rhetoric at this point.
Turns out the Biden administration was the blip. Yeah. And everybody knows this now.
And this might just be the start. I mean, I don't think the US pulling out of NATO is out of the question based on everything Trump has.
And we've talked about that. And so if Europe is going to defend itself, Germany is going to need an independent army, navy, and air force. And it's going to need an independent foreign policy. And German military might has atrophied to the point where it can barely put any kind of army in the field. So they've sent a lot of goods and money to the Ukrainians to do their fighting for them, basically. But their arms industry is nowhere where it needs to be. And they have not made the investments necessary in their military to be able to deter the Russians, let alone fight them, even with partners like the French and the British. There's just nothing there. So Merz really needs to relieve this debt break and start spending money on the military. Not just the military, though, also industrial infrastructure, because the German economy is short of infrastructure spending on railroads and power lines and simple stuff like that. So a lot of this analysis comes from the incomparable Adam Tooze, and we're on Substack now. So is he. And if you're not already on Chartbook, that's the name of Adam Tooze's Substack. I highly recommend subscribing. It's
But
fantastic.
yeah, I mean, and since we're talking about Germany, for my money, Two's wrote the single best book on World War II ever written. Uh,
Yeah.
it's called The Wages of Destruction, which, yeah, really fascinating book and will kind of change your mind on like how things worked during the Second World War. It
And
did for me.
I mean, he's magisterial and he's basically said they're 500 billion euros short of investment. The trains literally no longer run on time. They're actually worse than the British trains. And Germany used to have like world class infrastructure, world class transportation. It's no longer the case. And
Yeah,
that's why these governing parties have been losing steam. One of the reasons, right? It's like they can't invest.
like more broadly, we were talking about this before the show. I mean, the German economy was considered, along with post-war Japan, like a real post-war miracle.
Yeah, the cream of
Um,
the crop.
yes, at one point, the third largest economy in the world, really the gold standard in terms of manufacturing, things like luxury vehicles. Concern now, and this relates again to the rise of the AfD, is that Germany's economic model for some analysts might be broken. Now, there's
Yeah.
an argument to be made out there that this could be temporary. The fact that German factories in particular now have to spend enormous quantities on energy because as a result of the Ukraine war, the Russians have deprived Germany of natural gas.
The
Wh-
Germans have deprived themselves,
Yes,
actually,
fair,
of
fair
natural
enough.
gas.
Fair
Yeah.
enough.
The Russians
Um,
were happy to continue selling them
yes.
gas,
As
but
a
as part of
function
this,
of Germany's political decision making, they deprived themselves of gas. Yes.
yes.
But in an outcome that was entirely foreseeable, at least I remember even talking with you about this over a decade ago. In the aftermath of the Fukushima meltdown in
Oh,
Japan,
yeah.
Germany took all of its nuclear plants offline.
Yep.
That has had devastating consequences for
Mhm.
their energy economy. There is an argument that this might be temporary. The problem with that argument is that this seems to be more of a secular trend going back to 2019, that the German economy in real terms really hasn't grown. And it was an export led growth model that depended on exporting lots of goods and especially things like cars to China. Not only are Trump's tariffs really
Putting
raising
paid to that.
concerns, but also China's not importing nearly as many German goods and especially German cars because their own car sector has developed so much. And then there's also the problem of German demography. The population is not growing. Many people are concerned, if you know anything about the Nazi period,
Oh,
like
yeah.
the collapse of the Weimar economy had quite a bit to do with Hitler's rise to power. So, you're seeing some analysts draw that parallel now.
Yeah. So this is how all the things that we've talked about are linked. And I think that Germany is actually at the crux of this. And it's why we're talking about Germany this week. The United States is not going to guarantee European security for much longer. Even if it continues to pay lip service to NATO, nobody is going to trust that it's going to come to the rescue against the Russians. We've seen this now in Ukraine in a very big way. And it would not surprise me. I don't know how you feel about it, Galen, if the Trump administration just drops Ukraine unceremoniously and with no
I'm
further.
I
Yeah.
might expect. I mean, I think he wants to negotiate some sort of deal, but it already looks like U.S. military aid is bottoming out.
Dunzo.
There's just articles, this morning that the Europeans, the British and the French mainly, are trying to put together their own plan for a settlement. And this point you're raising, Steve, is really important. It gets to the question of how what used to be called the German problem was
Yeah.
resolved. So the problem after World War II was, okay, Germany has started two world wars and perpetrated the Holocaust. How
What do we
can
do with these
this,
guys? Yeah.
yeah, like how can this country be solved again? I'll shout out the Norm Macdonald clip because it's one of my favorite things ever. Germany decided to go to war with the world. So the problem was Germany had the potential to flip the power balance between the Soviet and American aligned blocs. So you needed some sort of solution that prevented it from falling squarely into either camp while also constraining its ability to pursue an independent foreign policy or to acquire an independent nuclear capability.
Mm.
And the solution to that was, divide the country basically and put West Germany in NATO and East Germany in the Warsaw Pact. Once the Americans and the Soviets kind of worked out a solution, that really stabilized matters. And then when the Cold War ended, it really seemed like things had stabilized, so much so that, movies like The Big Lebowski were making jokes about it. Like, say what you will about National Socialism, at least it's an ethos. He's
At least
talking
it's
about
an ethos.
he's talking
The
about
nihilists.
the nihilists. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was one pillar, was kind of an outside constraint. As you just said, it looks like the US is getting out of Dodge, so that constraint might be
Yeah.
gone.
And notably, like, Germany reunified in the early
Yes.
1990s, and that was a big step all by itself, because
Yes.
it's not like West Germany and East Germany had no military capability at that time. They actually did. And they don't anymore, but in the 90s, there was some major concerns from the other Western Europeans about this.
Yes. Yes. I mean, France and Germany have some history of their own, it turns out. So, then the other piece is, you and I talked last week. We think the Ukraine war, or 2 weeks ago, I think the Ukraine war has been a disaster for Russia. I'm not as concerned about the Russian threat in a conventional military sense, but
It is a
obviously,
threat.
yes, and the Europeans are worried about it. So that's back in the game.
Threat is
Uh,
about capability and intent.
yeah.
They've lost a lot of capability in terms of the number of people that have died and tanks that have gotten blown up, but their intent has been revealed to be malign.
Yeah. Now, whether that intent involves, invading Germany, I'm a little more skeptical.
It's only a Poland away from Russia.
So the point is, the Europeans certainly think the threat is there.
Yes.
And then the third plank was the change in German domestic politics and moving toward a much more pacific attitude, and a country that had really done an admirable job of confronting its past. And that's off the table. Like, kind of all of the pillars that were involved in solving the German problem have maybe been pulled out.
Yeah. So here's what we're talking about. We're talking about the new Chancellor of Germany identifying a need for Germany to step up and lead Europe in a security sense. This is a big deal. He's not wrong about it, but it represents a sea change for Germany, for Europe, and potentially for the entire world. Because when Germany is reunified and facing what it believes to be an external threat, and it starts to rearm, that raises a lot of troubling questions for the other European powers. And there's been a lot of questions within the European Union about German economic power, Germany being the economic engine of Europe. That's kind of no longer the case, which we've talked about. It's now countries like France and Spain and Italy that are outperforming Germany within the European Union. So
What a
it's like,
difference a decade makes.
yeah, I mean, when you're not able to invest in your economy because of a self-inflicted wound, you can call it a self-inflicted wound, but it's also of a piece with German policy since reunification, which is to not present a threat and to keep the genie in the bottle, because they don't even trust themselves for historical reasons. And they understand that people don't trust them either. Is the Russian threat enough, the new Russian threat, to outweigh the potential German threat that comes from a newly rearmed Germany at the center of Europe? That's the question.
Yes, especially because, the leadership of the AfD after the recent election was pretty ecstatic.
Yeah.
And they're basically already saying that their goal is to win in 2029, that they've got the next election in their crosshairs. And
Merz is kind of like the last stop for centrist politics in Germany. And the next stop is going to be probably an AfD-dominated government. Now, the AfD is a pretty interesting political party, and we should talk about it as a potential, new German leadership. They are notably strong in the former Eastern Germany, which has lagged behind Western Germany economically. Now everywhere is lagging. So the Eastern Germans, the former German Democratic Republic was what it was called during the Cold War, East Germany.
anytime democratic is in the title of a country's
Yeah.
name. It's not democratic. Sorry, go on.
DPRK,
Yeah.
DRC,
Yeah.
Democratic Republic of Congo. Some good examples, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the former sort of industrial heartland that has not done well, to put it mildly, especially with the, ongoing collapse of German industry that we've been talking about, especially with the cutoff of the cheap Russian gas that makes German exports competitive on the international market. So Germany has been undergoing deindustrialization, especially since the Ukraine war, and this has hurt East Germany really badly economically. AfD blames this on immigration and anti-Russian politics. And, this sounds a lot like the MAGA people within the GOP. And there's certainly a lot of similarities, obviously completely different historical background and trajectory. But it is sort of like this populist right front that is sweeping the democratic world right now. The United States, Italy, France as well, potentially. And now
Poland for a time,
Poland,
currently
Hungary.
Hungary. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Spain has one of these parties too, the Volks Party. And now Germany. If the AfD takes over in 2029, it's not clear what will happen. However, I think we should sort of examine this in more detail, because the leader of the AfD is a woman, Alice Weidel. And she is, I think, a really interesting politician with an interesting background. She
Yeah, I'm
joined the
gonna, I'm
party.
gonna let you talk about this because I didn't know the bio as well as you did, and it kind of blew my mind.
Yeah. So she has an interesting background. She is a former, I think, banker. She has a PhD. She is married to another woman. She's a mom, and she lives in Switzerland. And I associate exactly none of these traits with
Yeah.
neo-Nazis.
Although, and this is making my profession look bad, apparently the origins of this party when it first got going was a bunch of professors. It was called the Party of Professors in 2013. So
you and me, Galen, let's go.
Yeah, right.
Let's get into politics. Let's do this.
Yeah. No, that's a terrible idea.
Yeah. So the AfD has factions within its own party. It has a right-wing faction and a centrist faction, and she is in charge of the centrist faction. And there, obviously there's a lot of risk associated with which faction takes over the AfD, but the centrist faction seems to be firmly in control at the moment. And the policies are obviously anti-immigration, hardcore anti-immigration in a not very nice way. But while the AfD is Eurosceptic, Weidel has said it is too late for Germany to exit the European Union. It's too late for Germany to exit NATO. And it's too late for Germany to exit the euro, like the combined currency. And I don't think she's wrong about any of that. It would be incredibly painful for Germany to do that.
To your point, though, there are on the right wing of the party, there are people that disagree with that.
Yeah, they disagree militantly, literally militantly. And German right-wing politics is it's like a malarial swamp of weirdos and freaks.
It's wild.
Yeah, including monarchists, neo-Nazis, and these guys are constantly plotting, right?
There was a coup, an attempt to restore the Prussian throne a few years ago by what's called the Reichsbürger movement.
Yes.
Which has some tangential links to the AfD as well, but also influenced by QAnon. And it gets wild real quick.
Yeah. But from what I could tell, Weidel has positioned the AfD in a more centrist direction. And it now has a lot in common with, I think, Brothers of Italy is in charge of Italian politics under Giorgia Meloni. And the National Rally in France, no longer the National Front. So a lot of these xenophobic, hard right parties that, frankly, had kind of fascist overtones, overtly fascist overtones, have been to a certain extent cleaned up and sanitized by female leadership. And maybe she is running in this vein as well, because you look at what the policy is for the AfD under Alice Weidel. I wouldn't call it a neo-Nazi policy package. It's much closer to radical populism, right-wing populism. So again, MAGA in the United States and Italy under Meloni, right?
So the question is, one, how much of that is for instrumental purposes?
Yes.
It wouldn't be the first time, right? The disguise That's how the party does it before seizing power.
Yep.
Um, and second, whether the kind of center of gravity within the party ultimately gets taken over by people to her right.
The rest of the Germans certainly do not trust the AfD.
No. I will say I'm a little like hesitant to excuse the whole of the electorate. Most analysts think the number one cause of the rise of like hard right populism in Europe has been the immigration issue.
Yes.
Merkel's career was derailed because
Syrian refugees.
Syrian refugees.
Yep.
And at this point, I think that debate is largely settled. My understanding is like this isn't that particular point on immigration. Yes, the AfD is, I think you said, like meaner and more xenophobic about it.
Yeah.
But my understanding is like it's not terribly popular across Germany as a whole either, which puts them, by the way, in a real catch-22 going back to the economic issue because they have an aging population.
Mhm.
And if they're not going to replace their workforce via immigration, it becomes really hard to reverse that trend.
It's just going to shrink and it'll be more like Japan, which is not the best economically. Yeah. So that's, a major contradiction. Anyway, the AfD is not in charge, but they are waiting in the wings at this point. So this guy, Friedrich Merz, and the centrist coalition kind of has one last shot to get this right and to turn Germany around and make it the responsible security and economic engine of Europe, which is a bunch of tall orders,
Yeah.
to put it mildly.
Especially since they lack the political power in parliament to ram through the laws that they kind of need in order to do that.
To do radical reform, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess one way to think about this is if I'm part of the French political leadership or part of the Polish political leadership, and I'm looking back at history that, yes, it was a long time ago, but not ancient history. And I'm looking around the political trends throughout the continent. I'm not feeling great about if in 2029 the center cannot hold.
Yeah, I'm not feeling
It-
great if the AfD takes over and adopts a pro-Russian policy in order to get the former Eastern Germany back on its feet with cheap Russian gas. That's not amazing. But I mean, that might happen even before that with Merz in charge. We'll see. But if Merz is in charge and manages to rearm Germany, and then the AfD takes over that apparatus, that's extremely troubling,
Yeah.
to put it
And
mildly.
I'm going to avail myself of this opportunity to troll Gen Z some more. Yeah. Apparently, the AfD, part of their gains was they did really well with young voters, especially
young men.
Young men. So you guys did it again.
Yeah. Kind of mirroring MAGA in the United States, GOP under Trump. Young women mostly skewed hard left. And
Also similar to the United States.
Yeah, went over to the Delinka Party, which, the American equivalent would be like the very progressive Democrats under the Squad and AOC and stuff like that. So it's, pretty much everything is happening, not exactly the same across Western democracies, but there's a lot of commonalities, right?
In terms of where this leaves us with broader European security,
Yeah.
if you wanted to take the alarmist view, right, it's okay. The return of the Russian threat, the disintegration of European integration, and the loss of, U.S. security umbrella, hard right politics all over the country, including in Germany. There was a famous article. I think this is our third John Mearsheimer reference on this podcast. Like,
There's going to be way more than that.
okay, he wrote an article, I think in 1990 called Why Europe Will Still Miss the Cold War, or Why We Will Still Miss the Cold War. The argument was basically like, okay, the Cold War's over, so the United States doesn't have to care about European security anymore. So it withdraw back across the Atlantic, which means the Europeans now all have to provide for their own security, especially Germany. All of these various military rivalries that existed in Europe for centuries are going to resurface.
So it took 35 years.
Yeah. So you can't say he's right.
Yeah.
But,
like you wait long enough, everybody's right.
Yes. But I guess if you're taking an alarmist view, that's maybe the scenario.
The scenario is the United States withdraws its troops from Europe, especially Germany, because it still has tens of thousands of troops in Germany.
But I think it's around, check, but I think it's around 30,000 now, down from like a much larger number.
Much larger number. Yeah. During the Cold War, we were talking hundreds of thousands.
But I think even in the last decade, it's come down somewhat.
Yeah.
But I think it's around, I'll just check.
But the Americans basically just go home. And then
35,000. Yeah.
35,000. Yeah. The Germans are starting from a place of like abject weakness at the moment. The German army, the armed forces have less than 200,000 active duty troops. And by some accounts, Atom 2s in particular, it's like they cannot even field the operational division to fight anywhere. And the trains are now not good enough to even get heavy equipment to the field. There's no way for them to transport their military equipment anywhere because like investment has dried up so much. And like basically their industrial prowess and transport and logistics prowess, which used to be the best in Europe around the time of the Blitzkrieg in particular, it's just gone to zero. So it's like Germany is not now any kind of military threat. But in 10 years' time, in 10 years' time, then maybe they will have some capability along with the French and the British and the Nordics and the Poles. The Poles are, they're spending a lot of money on their military and rearming very quickly.
Well, also like you made reference to this earlier, like during the Cold War, the Reichswehr, which was what the German military was called at the time, was arguably the strongest contributing NATO force.
Yeah, because they thought the Russians were coming through the Fulda Gap. Right.
So it's not as if the Germans don't know how to do this.
They totally do.
Yeah. So I guess the much sunnier scenario is you could get, frankly, what, U.S. policy right after World War II, the dream, which was the emergence of a European third force.
Yep.
Sort of an integrated Europe that could stand on its own 2 feet and balance between the United States and Russia.
Wait a second. Did we ever really want that, though?
Yeah. I think under Eisenhower, that was the goal.
Under Eisenhower. Okay. Yeah. But did that stay the goal after de Gaulle did his thing?
Well, and then was it the EDC, the European Defense Community, ended up being a non-starter. Couldn't get through the issues involved in West German nuclearization.
Yeah.
But yeah, in general, I think the U.S. preference has been to varying degrees. I mean, yeah, the U.S. has kind of wanted to have it both ways.
They have. Yeah, they've wanted the Europeans to be dependent, and they have been.
Yeah, but both ways meaning dependent, and the U.S. doesn't have to foot the bill for European security.
Yeah,
and
which makes no sense.
I think it hasn't had it in those terms, had it both ways. But I'm sort of skeptical that's going to happen.
Think that Europe is going to be able to stand up on its own 2 feet.
I think
a European army
capability. Oh no, definitely not like a supranational military organization. I don't see that happening.
But some kind of like very tight alliance, maybe under the NATO footprint, minus the United States, basically.
Look, I would have been somewhat skeptical of that even during the heyday of European cooperation, the 90s. The Europeans did quite a bit in terms of economic integration, shared currency, open borders, things like that. Shared political integration is a different animal.
Although Europe does have its own parliament.
Yeah.
And that parliament has power.
But I just find it hard to believe, especially given the political trends we're witnessing. Yeah. And it could be possible that those end up being a short-term phenomenon. I just find it hard to believe that you're going to see sovereignty pooling when it comes to defense.
Yeah, key. That is the key to this whole thing. And the Russians under Putin certainly have an interest in Europe not pooling sovereignty and staying disunited and weak. And
the AfD is an ultranationalist party. If they win, that's the last thing they want is, more integration with the rest of Europe.
Yeah. Like I don't think they're, at least under Weidel, they're not talking about exiting the EU, but they're certainly not talking about like remilitarizing. And so there's 3 ways this could go. One way is Germany under Merz successfully remilitarizes and stays within a European framework and forms the backbone
All right.
of a European framework with capability.
So the center holds in Germany. That's one.
Yes. Yeah, that's one. And so we have this third force that's basically the European Union that's rearmed under German leadership, because that's the way it would have to be. The second way it goes is Germany rearms, the AfD takes over and starts doing malign shit with all that new capability. And
Starts doing malign shit. Maybe that's the title of the episode.
yeah, malign shit. Malign Scheisse. So that is like a darker Europe, right? The third possibility is Europe fails to rearm and Europe remains weak and either united or disunited, but it's weak, so it doesn't matter. So the Russians get to kind of do it. They have a free hand in Eastern Europe, other than against the Poles and the Finns and the Nordics, I guess.
Assuming they can get their house in order. I think the Russians are such a mess. Like, I think there's at least some time before they're going to be able to.
The Ukraine war, if nothing else, has certainly bought time for European rearmament. And I think that they're going to try to do it. But democratically, these are all democracies. And you alluded to these right-wing parties that don't want to spend a bunch of money on rearmament and are pro-Russian anyway. So it, by and large, although Meloni in Italy, again, is anti-Russian.
Yeah.
It doesn't always hold.
If I'm looking at, it seems like the forces pulling apart, though, to me, are stronger than the forces pulling together. I mean,
yeah,
Brexit was almost 10 years ago now.
It's crazy. That's so crazy.
Oh, I hate
the first referendum, right? Yeah.
I hate that shit, man. I hate feeling this old. But yes, they never adopted the euro, but like that was a big blow. And you have hard right parties that have either taken power or are threatening to take power.
Yep. Hard right party has taken power in the United States.
Yeah. And, like there is an argument out there. Anyone who has, I guess taken graduate level international relations knows that institutions are sticky. And so they kind of have a force of their own, and just dismantling more than a half century of European integration efforts won't happen overnight. But I think we've also seen in the US that institutions are not a complete block and can be overridden. And that's within a single country. To me, I'm not optimistic. And this was a big electoral shift for the AfD to win this big. And to be such a young party. It's a dozen years old and is now the second most influential party in the country.
Okay. Counterpoint, they still only have 1/5 of the country, and it's highly regionalized.
That's true.
It's not clear to me. It's not clear to me that they're going to be able to make real inroads into West Germany. It's like they've done better in West Germany for sure, but it's like they're going to need to get, closer to 30% of the vote.
And I think that's right, but I think within 4 years, there's a real chance that the current coalition is pretty unpopular if they're not able to deliver the goods.
And the AfD and Die Linke are going to try to stop them from delivering the goods. So Merz has a huge and historically, decisive job on his hand here. Like basically, I think the future direction of Europe kind of depends on it. The Russians, meanwhile, will be making trouble. And,
as will Elon Musk, who backed the AfD.
That's right. Who's famously promoted the AfD. So has JD Vance. And he's excoriated the Europeans for, basically maintaining this sanitization scheme against these hard right parties, refusing to work with them in parliamentary coalitions. He's saying that's not democratic. Yes and no, right? I mean, the institutions are working the way they're intended to. It's not like anything that's happening is extra constitutional.
Yes, and European and especially German approaches to free speech have never been exactly what the US approach to free speech is.
Not at all.
It's in a quite different direction. But yeah, Musk, I guess, infamously wrote, "Only the AfD can save Germany." And he and Vance are really pushing this line that trying to sideline something like the AfD is anti-democratic behavior.
Yeah. So if we have United States and Russia both putting their thumb on the scale for these parties, it's probably going to make a difference. So I think so much comes down to this one guy's individual leadership capability, along with, leadership in the UK, France, and a handful of other places.
And like we will get a test here, right? So there's this debate that's long standing whether I guess Americans give themselves too much credit for kind of
Probably.
for solving Europe. Um, but the argument is like the American pacifier argument that if the US provides for Europe's defense, that makes kind of the security dilemmas between European states a lot less severe.
Yeah.
And if the US does pull back, we will see whether we should have credited European agency more or whether that argument was correct.
Whether the EU has gone deep enough and has lasted long enough to become a proto-state is the way I would put it. And my research focused on this, and the catalyzation is really about external threat. Another way to play this is to say that the Europeans now regard the Americans as a threat. And I don't know that I would go that far.
I
But
wouldn't, but I've heard many Europeans using that phrasing recently.
yeah, like not only are you guys not on our side anymore, but we now have to watch you and we don't trust you anymore based on your leadership.
Not to defend Trump in any way, but that's not what he said. Even during the infamous meeting with Zelensky, he basically said, I'm aligned with no one. I'm aligned with the United States. He didn't
Yeah.
say, I'm, aligned against the Europeans. So I wouldn't go
Yeah.
that far.
No, I wouldn't either. But he's famously fond of Putin. And yeah, I think the MAGA
And you can never
Republicans-
know. You can never know with him.
Yeah, the MAGA Republicans are generally pro-Russia from what I've seen. And like, that's not nothing. Who knows what's going to happen in the United States? I think we know what's going to happen in Russia for the foreseeable future, but I don't know what's going to happen in the United States. So that's another sort of huge variable here. I think if you have the United States on one side and Russia on the other side interfering in European affairs, the Europeans will be even more motivated to come together and take a stand, but they may not be able to, right?
That's an interesting argument, though, that the outside pressure from each side could lead to a rally around the continent effect.
Exactly. If the argument is the Russians aren't capable enough to threaten Europe, and I'm pretty sympathetic to that argument, they have a lot of nukes and Putin likes to wave them around, but France and Britain have nukes too. So there's some degree of mutual deterrence there. Conventionally, we've seen that the Russians are dangerous and remain dangerous, but are they going to be able to get to Germany through Poland? Probably not.
I thought their conventional forces were overrated pre-war in Ukraine. And
yeah, it turns out that they were eaten away by corruption. They were basically hollowed out. All the gas in the vehicles was like watered down and shit. It's like really bad, So
the other point about Germany that I think maybe this is a different way of making a point you already get. It's like labor in the UK has been like decimated. The left in Israel doesn't exist anymore.
However, Labour is now in charge in the UK.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, fair enough. But under, was it Corbyn, right? They were done.
Yeah, they were done.
They were they were like a non-existent factor.
But the Tories did such a shit job.
Yeah.
In every possible respect. And that's how we know that the UK is still a democracy, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, to that point, this is actually an even brighter hope or point of optimism, I guess. The left in Germany is not by any means dead. This is a centrist coalition. And yes, the Social Democrats did not do well, but they had a historically bad election. I doubt it's going to be
Olaf Scholz was a crap chancellor.
Yes.
Too.
Well, and in difficult, just structural conditions.
Yeah.
And
he had a three-way coalition. Couldn't get anything done.
And they still had, they still finished third. And you can make that argument. Yeah. Your point on the UK is a good one, that the left is not down and out as it has been in other contexts. I guess I'll raise the Israeli case again. Labor is dead in Israel and it's not coming back.
Not in the same form, right?
I don't know if at all. What are they getting? 3 seats in the Knesset now or something?
Wow.
Yeah,
that's
it's
awful.
bad.
So they're going to have to go to the right, basically.
So that is not what we're talking about. Another point is in Poland, there was a concern that an authoritarian movement was taking place, and the
Law and
polls
justice.
kind
Yeah.
of succeeded in like pushing back on that and getting that party out. There is reason to think, yeah, I guess to your Tory point, if these guys do a crappy enough job, that the
Yeah.
voters will vote them out.
Sure. But like AFD isn't even in control yet.
Right.
They're in opposition and they can be like, they can make the point, we have no power. These guys own everything. The centrists have fucked up again, assuming the centrists do fuck up. I think there's a chance the centrists will like pull it together and actually make some necessary changes and like things will turn around and AFD support diminishes.
And this is like the question I always get from people is like, how much of the concern about the AFD is purely based on historical
A lot,
iterations?
a ton. Yeah. And as you say, Germany has laws, anti-Nazi laws that are like constitutionally ensconced, right? So it's like the AfD started out looking a lot Nazier. Is, is that an adjective?
We'll go with it.
Although it was apparently run by academics and these things just don't make sense to me. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. And it seems to have moved towards the center somewhat.
See, I'm a little, I don't know if I'd phrase it like the initial, as I understand it, the initial guys that put the party together were really concerned about immigration. Okay, that's still the case, and even more so with the party, like pretty anti-EU and wanting to cut government spending, but like
Okay.
sort of like a traditional conservative party.
Yeah, or a populist party, populist
Yeah.
conservative. It's like, where's the line between, right-wing populism and what could be deemed like neo-Nazism?
So that my understanding is in the intervening years, there have been some neo-Nazi types that have influenced the party and the platform. Interesting to me how big of a slice of this 20% that the AFD just won is from that wing of the party.
And where they are now, like where they dwell politically now, are they still in the party or has Vidal succeeded in either marginalizing them inside the party or kicking them out? Because I think she's been about that job. And I think that probably has some influence as well over the AFD's newfound popularity. It's the fact that it's actually moved towards the center somewhat. And this is the other argument. It's these guys get into power or they approach power, and they actually start to moderate. And we haven't seen that in the United States, at least not yet. And it's not like a hard and fast rule,
now,
obviously.
but like all part of that has to do with just like electoral institutions. Like we have this shitty two-party system where votes count by different amounts depending on where you live.
The idiosyncratic American system, yeah.
Yeah, like the parliament. Now, like, by the way, just because I have students make this point all the time that like problems just disappear in parliamentary democracies. No, like parliamentary democracies can have all sorts of problems too, like
Yeah, lack of accountability.
And
due to
fringe
coalitions.
part like you need to get over the majority then can have massively outsized influence because you need their like 3 seats to move the needle into a majority. And like
Your students make that point? You got some good students, man. It's not bad.
no, they make the point that parliamentary systems like are awesome.
Okay,
Like,
you make the point to them.
I'm making the point like, yes, there are don't get me started on American electoral laws and the American electoral system. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a mess. Yeah.
But like parliamentary systems have problems too.
Yeah. I mean, they totally do, right? It's strengths and weaknesses on both sides. But yeah, like parliamentary systems do tend to militate against the extremes because of the need to form coalitions and the need to appeal towards the center. But it's not a hard and fast rule.
Yeah.
The Nazis took over a parliamentary system, and Hitler famously remarked after he won a plurality, not a majority, "We are entering power because we are the better Democrats." And obviously, he went about dismantling German parliamentary democracy under a state of emergency immediately after that. But like in the sense of the party was voted in by voters, and it took power under constitutional rules. He was correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why I'm a little more alarmist than you. It's not even necessarily like German specific, although obviously like you can't really talk about these things without those historical legacies at play. Is like
Yeah,
that's not a bad example, right? Weimar Germany was like maybe the most liberal place
it
like in
was,
the
but
world,
like
and it flipped really quickly, and the Nazis were quite popular eventually throughout
they were
Germany.
quite popular. Counterpoint, the Germans are not, there's no Treaty of Versailles
Yeah,
situation
that's
at
true.
this point. The economic troubles are like not even in the same hemisphere comparatively. Like the immigration stuff, like people get extremely upset over immigration, especially illegal immigration. And that's a policy debate. It's also an emotional debate, but I don't think it's the same thing, you
No,
know?
I mean, look, great points. I
Yeah.
can see them both. Yes. What's your like bottom line
Yeah.
alarm? What are the odds that, Europe is just ripping itself apart?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna be an asshole and say 50-50.
Didn't you do that last time, man?
Yes. Because I like it. No, I'm actually an optimist.
I was
I
going to
think
say, I'm not even at 50-50. Like, I'm not as
yeah.
alarmed as that. I'm like, I don't know, 30-70.
I'm gonna say 2/3 for Europe figuring it out under Germany, like including Germany, versus 1/3 not. Because I think the Europeans do have an independent identity and they do have shared values. There will be a way to encompass like these populist elements and take away power from the true extremists within the context of the European Union. I believe that. Italy has not left the European Union. I don't think France would leave the European Union under national rally. I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong about any of this, but I don't think so.
Like, we're figuring it out too.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that like countries tend to respond to external pressure by consolidating. And they're not like France and Germany and Italy are not going to do better independently against Russia and the United States. I think most in those countries understand that.
so can I mean, I'm going to throw one more giant wrench in this,
Yeah.
which is like, especially if it's the framework you're laying out, which is Germany is kind of the leader of a separate European alliance, which by the way, like a lot of things would have to happen for us to get there. Like it's not a
Yeah.
foregone
This is like a decade at least
yes,
away.
it's not a foregone conclusion that the US exits NATO. Like
Yeah.
a lot of things would have to happen. But if Germany is the leader of the alliance, but even if it's not, if it's pursuing an independent foreign policy and providing for its own security, in the past, the problem was that meant it had to have its own nuclear arsenal,
Ooh,
which was always the biggest problem. Like in some ways, it was the problem of the Cold War.
interesting.
I don't know if the Germans are even thinking about getting the bomb. There's been talk of a Euro deterrent, like a supranational
Yeah.
sort of French, UK, German um, nuclear organization. But
Yeah.
that could, and I could see the AFD being interested in going nuclear, and Germany certainly could do it quickly.
It would be cheaper than fully rearming and in some ways more effective.
Would also be extremely provocative. I mean, that's like
Yeah.
Russia's worst nightmare. In some ways, it's France's worst nightmare.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think you're making a great point because like nuclear armament is like the deepest manifestation of sovereignty there is. Truly. It's the ability to end any other country unilaterally, even if you get ended yourself, right? Like that's the ultimate power and it's the ultimate sovereign power. And yeah, the French famously evinced no willingness whatsoever to get rid of their independent nuclear deterrent. Things got kind of weird between the United States and the UK when the UK went nuclear. The Americans did not share their nuclear secrets with the British, even though the alliance couldn't be any closer, right?
And even though the British had done a lot of things to help out the Manhattan Project during the war.
Absolutely. Yeah, so they had to kind of figure it out themselves and they did. However, like a lot of the technology they use for the deterrent now is American technology, which is interesting. They have independent command though. So, willingness to share with the Germans, I mean, the Americans,
or even if the Germans just decide to try to get their own. And
yeah,
like, I just, I'm only, I don't think we're going to figure out like what could happen, what will happen. I'm just raising it because in the past, it was an enormous political question. And I
yeah,
imagine if any of these scenarios we're discussing come to pass, that's a
that would be
question
the
that can't be
crux.
avoided.
That would be the crux for, especially for France and also partially for the UK. I think more for France though, because the French have been so adamant about maintaining independent capability within all these other institutions that they're embedded in. And they've been adamant in part because of Germany, in large part,
Yeah.
and for other historical reasons. So it's, would they ever be willing to dissolve some element of that into a larger supranational entity? They haven't done it to this point. I think you can invert that and be like, would they countenance Germans getting independent deterrent?
So that was going to be our next question. Would
Yeah.
the Germans, and that's to say nothing of the Russians, right?
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Yeah. The Russians would have something to say about this for sure,
yes.
because the Germans inflicted, what, 50 million deaths on
No.
the Soviet Union?
I don't know how many in World War One.
Oh, yeah. I wasn't even
The
thinking about World War One.
the dead in World War II, Soviet deaths is 27 million, but
Okay.
that's just
27.
deaths. So you typically multiply that by 3 for total casualties. So it's 80 like just astronomical numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, we can't really oversell the point about the Russians not liking the Germans very much or trusting them due to historical reasons.
By the way, that was one reason that things were a little easier to handle when Merkel was chancellor. She was
Mhm.
from East Germany. She was relatively pro-Russian.
Yeah.
So that's no longer a card the Germans could play because she sort of had decent relations with Putin and was able to kind of negotiate things.
Interestingly, earlier in Putin's career, he was posted to Eastern Germany as a KGB liaison, I think. And I think he speaks German and knows a lot about the Germans. So that's neither here nor there. Yeah. I think you're right. I think you've hit the nail on the head as to the real crux. I don't think that question's going to be answered anytime soon. I think we're first going to see whether Merz
Yeah.
can turn Germany around, even conventionally and economically. And I don't know enough about German politics to be able to say. I think that the German elites and the centrists are highly motivated at
Yes.
this point because they do see that this is the last stop.
Okay. And then I should have said this earlier. One other point. Look, I suppose these voters could flip, but there's not a lot of non-voters to win in Germany
Not anymore.
because Germans vote. I was actually It's astonishing. This most recent US election
84%.
yeah, this most recent US election was one of the highest turnouts, and it was like 64%. The Germans were around 84, 85%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
We're
I don't know.
scraping the bottom of the barrel then. And by the way, AFD wins a ton of non-voters or former non-voters,
Yeah.
just like MAGA Republicans.
So maybe there's kind of a upper cap on where they can go,
Yeah,
in
exactly.
contrast to other places. But
And if they enter a coalition, if they can't win outright, and I don't see how AFD can win outright. Like, I just don't see how they get to, 50%. Then, depending on how high they get, let's say they get 30%, then they're going to need a centrist coalition partner. There's no way around that.
I'm not totally sure how the like translation to seats goes because I
Yeah.
think if you don't get, I think it's a 5% threshold in
You
Germany.
get no
You don't
seats.
get any seats, so you get more.
Yeah.
If you are above that, you end up getting more seats than was represented by the percentage of votes. But
Yep.
they would have to do at least 50% better, if not double what they did in this election.
Yeah, to win a coalition.
But the bottom line is Europe is at a moment of transition where a lot
Yes.
of kind of history and institutional, organizations, a lot of relationships internationally are getting shaken up all at the time when this party had its best showing ever. And I think
Yep.
that has some people concerned.
The Europeans for sure are very concerned. And the
I'm
Germans
I'm
themselves.
not freaking out, but I'm I'm in the spot where I'm definitely not dismissing. I'm not in the camp of this could never happen in Germany again.
It could
I'm not
totally happen in
I'm not
Germany.
really
Yeah.
in that camp for any country, like I get really frustrated with when Americans say things like this can't happen.
Yeah. You remember in 2016, the New York Times election model had a sub 10% chance of Trump winning. And just on the face of it, that was bullshit. It's like he was at the head of one of the two parties. Come on.
Correct.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
Yeah.
And Nate Silver had him at like 35% or something. And it's
Yeah.
okay, that's reasonable.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. He's like an underdog, but not prohibitive. And guess what? The underdog wins sometime, you know? So anyway, shall we leave it there?
Yeah, I think so.
That was a comprehensive discussion, my friend.
I hope our viewers think so.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Till next time. This has been Global Tantrum.
All right. See you later, Steve.
Bye.